The serving tray remained balanced on the edge of the dining surface. The moment the woman's hands began to move, the entire ballroom seemed to fall silent. Just a second before, the young boy had been screaming without producing a single vocal word. 7-year-old Ethan stood near the center of the grand ballroom at the landmark hotel in Savannah, surrounded by 300 guests dressed in formal attire. From his throat came a sound that was neither a clear word nor a typical cry, but a raw expression of absolute overload. He held his hands pressed firmly against his ears. The live band had stopped playing, the service staff had frozen in place, and not a single person among the city's most distinguished attendees knew how to respond to a child who could not hear and could no longer handle the environment. Dora was walking across the floor, carrying 12 glasses of champagne, when she noticed the commotion. She immediately recognized the boy's distress. Setting her tray down on the nearest table, alongside the polished silverware, she paid no mind to hotel protocols or her supervisory staff. She knelt directly in front of Ethan, bringing herself down to his eye level, and began to communicate using her hands. Her fingers moved with steady, deliberate care to spell out her message. "I am right here with you. Take a deep breath with me." The boy opened his eyes. Though his body continued to tremble, he focused entirely on her. He saw 2 hands moving specifically for him, conveying a message meant directly for his understanding. Dora continued shaping thoughts in the quiet air, reminding him that nobody was judging him and that the surrounding chaos was fading away. She asked him to keep his eyes fixed solely on her face. Ethan slowly lowered his hands from his ears and raised his own fingers to reply. His movements were shaky and unrefined, characteristic of a child still learning. As he signed that everything felt overwhelmingly intense. Dora nodded with warm recognition, signing back that she understood completely. She suggested they count to 5 together. When Ethan expressed hesitation, signing that counting felt difficult when his whole body was shaking, Dora reassured him. She offered to count first, so he could simply mirror her gestures. She held up one finger, and Ethan hesitantly matched it. She moved to 2, maintaining a calm cadence that guided his focus. By the time they reached 3, the surrounding tension had visibly dropped. They progressed to 4, and then 5, completing the full count finger by finger. They shared a quiet conversation in a room that had been filled with overwhelming noise, just moments earlier. Dora checked on his well-being, asking if the inner shaking had stopped. Ethan replied that it had settled down to just a small amount, touching his chest to indicate where the feeling remained. Dora assured him that such a feeling was entirely natural. She shared that she felt the same way whenever she was surrounded by large crowds, explaining her personal strategy of finding one kind face in the room to focus on. She then asked if he could see any kind faces nearby. Ethan looked around at the 300 formally dressed guests, observing the interaction. His gaze returned to Dora, and he pointed directly at her. Touched by his response, Dora smiled gently and signed that he was safe. She promised him that as long as she was present, he would always have a supportive face to look toward. Ethan used his hands to ask for her name, his posture notably calmer than before. Dora spelled out her name letter by letter, then demonstrated a unique personal sign she created by bringing her fingers together to represent a blossoming flower. She explained that this gesture was her name sign. Ethan mirrored the movement, admiring the sign of the opening flower, and asked with immense curiosity how she knew how to communicate this way when no one else around him did. Dora explained that she had a brother who was also deaf, and she had learned to sign when she was even younger than Ethan is now, so she could talk to him. Ethan asked if her brother was currently alone. Dora reassured him that her brother was surrounded by people who had learned his language, just as Ethan would be. The boy stated plainly that he had no one in his life who knew how to sign, observing that Dora was the only one, and they had just met. Dora gently held both of his hands in hers. She reassured him that he was not the only person who communicated this way, explaining that an entire community of people used sign language. She noted that while the two of them happened to be the only ones in that room who knew it tonight, that did not mean he was isolated. It simply meant they shared a special secret. For the first time all evening, Ethan smiled. Arthur, the host of the gala and owner of major commercial enterprises across the region, made his way through the crowd in a state of deep worry. Above all his professional titles, he was a father, watching his son drift further out of reach every single day. He had hired 3 different specialists for the event, yet none had been able to approach or comfort the boy. Arthur himself had been unable to bridge the distance. He came to a sudden halt a few feet away. Before him stood a hotel server in full uniform, kneeling on the floor and communicating effortlessly with his son through sign language. For the first time that night, Arthur saw his son breathing comfortably and sitting in peace. Stunned by the scene, Arthur stood frozen with an forgotten drink in his hand, his voice raspy, as he finally managed to ask who she was. Dora stood up quickly, suddenly reminded of her workplace surroundings, her unfinished tasks, and strict staff policies. She apologized immediately, stating that she did not mean to step out of bounds and was preparing to leave. Arthur stopped her, pointing out that she had accomplished in less than a minute what 3 hired professionals could not achieve all evening. He asked her earnestly not to walk away. Ethan tugged at Dora's sleeve and pointed toward his father. He signed a question asking if the man was her father, to which she clarified that he was Ethan's father. Ethan observed that his father did not know how to sign and only moved his mouth. Dora swallowed hard, choosing not to translate the child's exact remark. When Arthur pressed her to explain what his son had communicated, Dora offered a gentle cover, telling him the boy mentioned being tired. Before Dora could step back, Ethan repeated the sign for the opening flower, pointed toward the exit, and then pointed to himself 3 times with clear insistence. A gesture Dora understood completely, even if his father could not. Dora was 26 years old and had spent the last 3 years working service shifts at the downtown hotel. Throughout that entire duration, no guest had ever inquired about her name or background. She had grown up in a modest 2-room home on the outskirts of the county with her younger brother Thomas, who was born deaf. Learning sign language had never been a career choice or a formal path for her. It was simply the essential means of letting her brother know that dinner was ready, that it was safe to cross the street, and that he was deeply loved. Seeing Ethan in the middle of the gala, Dora did not see a wealthy child in a grand hall. She saw her brother at 7 years old, trapped in a sensory world that no one around him understood. The morning after the gala, Dora was summoned to the executive offices on the main floor. She walked down the hallway fully expecting to receive a formal termination notice for breaching protocol during a high-profile event. However, instead of the primary general manager waiting behind the desk, she found Arthur standing near the window, dressed in a dark business suit. Dora paused near the doorway and greeted him politely, assuming her employment was being ended. Arthur offered a weary smile and requested that she take a seat. Dora expressed a preference to remain standing, asking directly if she was being let go. Arthur explained that he was actually there to ask for her assistance. He described how his son had been obsessively repeating a specific hand gesture since the previous night, bringing his fingers together to form a shape like a flower, before pointing toward the front door. He noted that the specialists could not interpret the action, and he was hoping she might know what it meant. Dora felt a tight knot in her throat as she explained that the gesture was the personal name sign she had taught Ethan the night before. She clarified that by making that gesture and pointing to the door, the boy was expressing a clear wish to see her again. Arthur stood in silence for a long moment, reflecting on the situation. He shared that he had spent 3 years paying top regional experts to help him understand his son, Yet a hotel server had knelt down for 30 seconds and earned a personal name sign in return. He asked her directly what he had done wrong. Dora replied that he had done nothing wrong out of malice, but pointed out that he was attempting to communicate with Ethan in a medium the boy could not process. She explained that while Arthur spoke with his voice, Ethan listened with his eyes, meaning that without hand gestures, spoken words appeared to the boy as nothing more than moving lips. Arthur mentioned that he had enrolled Ethan in the most prestigious academy available. When Dora inquired how many signs Arthur knew himself, he paused before admitting he did not know any. Dora respectfully observed that despite providing every available resource, Arthur had omitted the one thing his son actually required: for his father to sit down, look him in the eye, and make a genuine effort to learn his language, regardless of how awkward the initial attempts might be. She explained that a deaf child does not mourn the absence of sound because they have no concept of hearing. What they truly long for is to be understood by the people around them. Arthur leaned against the desk, looking visibly burdened. He recalled the way Ethan had looked at Dora when she knelt beside him, a look he had never received from his son. He expressed how painful it was as a parent to watch his child readily open up to a stranger while keeping his own father on the outside. His voice cracked slightly as he clarified that he did not blame Dora, but held himself accountable, recognizing that she possessed the key to connecting with his son. When Dora offered a soft apology for speaking so plainly, Arthur stepped forward and assured her that her honesty was exactly what he needed. He proposed that she leave her position at the hotel to come to his home 3 afternoons a week to teach sign language to both Ethan and himself. Dora reminded him that she was not a certified instructor, but Arthur dismissed the distinction, pointing out that her brother had been fortunate to have her, and he wanted the same support for his son. He offered to pay her triple her current hotel wage. Dora clarified that her decision was not driven by monetary compensation. Arthur acknowledged this, noting that her genuine care was the precise reason he was asking for her help. He reiterated how much it meant to see his son breathe easily for the first time in months. Dora thought of her brother, her daily tasks at the hotel, and the young boy who had signed the opening flower while pointing toward the door. She agreed on one strict condition: Arthur had to commit fully to learning the language rather than making a superficial effort for appearances, emphasizing that a child easily perceives when an effort is half-hearted. Arthur looked at her intently before extending his hand to solidify their agreement. Before releasing her grip, Dora offered one final piece of advice, urging him never to leave Ethan alone in front of a television or tablet as a substitute for presence. She encouraged him to sit alongside his son and point out items in the room while speaking clearly, emphasizing that seeing his father try meant far more to the boy than flawless execution. When Arthur remarked that her advice sounded deceptively simple, Dora noted that while hiring someone is easy, sitting on the floor together takes real effort, and the simplest actions often require the greatest commitment. The family estate was situated in an upscale neighborhood, behind a tall stone perimeter wall covered in ivy. It featured a sprawling lawn where Ethan could run freely across the grass. When Dora arrived on Saturday morning, Ethan spotted her from the window and rushed outside to meet her. He stopped directly in front of her and, trembling with excitement, formed the sign for the opening flower. Dora greeted him warmly and introduced a new sign she had created specifically for him, a gentle hand movement resembling a leaf drifting down from a tree. Ethan copied the gesture immediately, breaking into a silent, full-face smile. He signed to ask if she would be coming every day. Dora explained that she would be visiting 3 afternoons each week to teach many new signs, including teaching his father. Ethan wrinkled his nose with playful skepticism, signing that his father was slow at learning things, though he added that his father was a good person. Curious, Dora asked why he felt that way. Ethan explained that when his father thought he was asleep, He would come into his room and just stand there watching over him. The boy shared that even though his father did not speak to him because he did not know how, he stayed anyway, and Ethan would pretend to be asleep so his father would not leave. Dora felt a deep wave of sympathy in her chest. She asked why Ethan did not simply let his father know he was awake, to which the boy replied that he did not know how because they lacked common words. Dora promised him that starting today, they would begin building a shared vocabulary together. Arthur stood near the doorway with his hands in his pockets, watching the interaction. He admitted to Dora that he had never seen his son run toward anyone like that before. Dora replied that people naturally move toward those who truly see them, then invited Arthur to take a seat on the floor for their first official session. When Arthur hesitated about sitting directly on the kitchen floor in his formal trousers, Dora reminded him that Ethan lived at that level, and talking down to him from above meant addressing his knees rather than his eyes. Arthur sat down awkwardly opposite Dora, with Ethan positioned comfortably between them. Dora asked Arthur what single message he most wanted to convey to his son if he had only one phrase to use. The accomplished businessman, accustomed to leading high-stakes negotiations, found himself temporarily at a loss for words before his own child. He admitted quietly that he wanted to tell Ethan that he loved him and that he was sorry. Dora suggested starting with the first thought, leaving the second to be demonstrated through actions over time. Dora demonstrated the sign for affection, raising her hand with the middle fingers folded down, while keeping her thumb, index, and pinky extended. Arthur tried to replicate the posture, but his hand position was visibly clumsy. Ethan chuckled silently and signed that his father was doing it wrong. When Arthur asked if his son was laughing at him, Dora clarified that the boy was laughing with him, which made all the difference. Dora reached across and guided Arthur's fingers into the correct position one by one. The physical touch lasted only a few seconds, but both adults acknowledged the quiet significance of the moment. Dora instructed Arthur to look directly into Ethan's eyes, rather than focusing on his own hand. Arthur turned toward his son, who was watching him with absolute focus. Raising his trembling hand, Arthur communicated with his fingers for the very first time in 7 years, delivering a silent message of love. Ethan froze for a moment, examining his father's hand before looking up at his face. Suddenly, the boy threw his arms around his father's neck. Arthur held his son tightly and buried his face in the boy's hair, overwhelmed by the breakthrough. He asked with a strained voice what had just occurred. Dora stepped back slightly toward the window to give them privacy, explaining that his son had finally heard him because he had chosen to speak his language. Without releasing his hold on Ethan, Arthur asked Dora to teach him another sign immediately before he lost his composure. He expressed a desire to learn how to tell Ethan not to go to sleep feeling upset with him. Dora smiled gently, explaining that such a thought required a full sentence, but suggested starting with the sign for apology. She demonstrated by moving her flat palm in a gentle circle over her chest, explaining that the gesture represented soothing a spot that hurt. Arthur attempted the sign, and Ethan reached out from his embrace to adjust his father's hand position, mirroring Dora's earlier guidance with the serious demeanor of a tiny instructor. The interaction brought a warm laugh to both adults. Dora remarked that Ethan was proving to be a thorough teacher, to which Arthur agreed, noting lightheartedly that his son was far more demanding than expected. During that single afternoon, they successfully covered 6 fundamental signs: home, eat, father, again, good, along with the personal name sign for the opening flower, which Arthur practiced privately in his office later that evening, until he mastered it completely. These afternoon sessions quickly established a meaningful routine. The 3 of them gathered regularly on the kitchen floor rather than at the long, formal dining table, choosing the space where Ethan felt most comfortable to build their vocabulary word by word. Arthur inquired about various terms, learning how to sign objects like stars by extending his hand upward with twinkling fingers, as well as complex emotional concepts. When Arthur asked how to sign the concept of missing someone, Dora placed her hand over her heart and slowly closed her fingers, illustrating the idea of holding something valuable close to one's chest. Arthur mirrored the gesture while looking directly at her. Dora advised him gently not to close his hand too tightly, comparing the motion to holding something delicate that must not be crushed. When Arthur asked to learn a more challenging term, Dora inquired what he had in mind. Arthur shared that he wanted to tell Ethan how proud he was of him, mentioning how his son had completed a large puzzle the previous day, and Arthur had only known how to pat him on the head like a pet, which felt deeply inadequate. Dora demonstrated the sign by placing her thumb against her chest and lifting it upward in a firm, deliberate motion. She explained that the gesture signified pride, because genuine pride lifts a person up. She encouraged Arthur to save the sign for bedtime that evening so he could experience his son's reaction firsthand. Arthur asked to learn one final term for the day, the sign for being together with someone. Dora paused for a brief moment before demonstrating the action, pointing toward the other person and bringing both hands together side by side. Arthur replicated the movement, pointing directly at Dora before joining his hands. Both of them immediately recognized the silent implication of his gesture. Dora noted quietly that he had executed the sign perfectly on his first try, to which Arthur replied that perhaps some expressions were already understood deep down. Ethan stepped in to direct the rest of the session, proudly demonstrating signs for various animals and treats. He showed the gestures for a dog, a cat, and ice cream, executing each one slowly for his father to follow. Dora smiled and asked why he had introduced the sign for ice cream before other common items. Ethan explained with complete child logic that if his father knew how to sign ice cream, he could buy it for him. Arthur laughed aloud as he processed the child's reasoning, realizing he was being skillfully persuaded by his own son without a single spoken word. Dora noted that a child requesting a treat was a clear sign that he felt secure and confident in his surroundings. Arthur readily agreed, turning to Ethan to sign the word for ice cream and agreeing to go get some immediately. Ethan raised his arms in silent celebration and headed toward the hallway. Dora remarked to Arthur that his son had successfully communicated a request and received a positive response in his own language, an interaction that would have been impossible just a month prior. She encouraged him to cherish these small daily victories, noting that while the early struggles might eventually fade from memory, these quiet moments represented profound progress. Ethan's confidence expanded noticeably over the following weeks. One afternoon, he excitedly signed to Dora that a new teacher at his school had learned 3 basic signs to greet him by name, which had made him laugh with joy. He listed the signs she had used: hello, good morning, and very good, noting with pride that while her execution was shaky, she was making an effort, and he had even taught her the sign for friend in return. Dora listened attentively as Ethan crossed his index fingers to demonstrate the sign for friendship, explaining that true friends take the time to learn your language. When Dora asked why the moment had meant so much to him, Ethan shared that having someone at school address him by his name sign made him feel like he truly existed. He observed that when people failed to communicate with him, he felt like an invisible piece of furniture that everyone passed without noticing. Dora assured him that he was always meaningful and visible. Ethan shook his head emphatically, sharing that after his father used the sign for pride the previous night, he felt a deep sense of belonging, realizing he was no longer isolated, but belonged to his father, and to Dora as well. Touched by his sincerity, Dora held back her emotion and affirmed that he held a permanent place in her heart. Later that evening, after Ethan had gone to sleep, Dora shared the boys' reflections with Arthur while they cleaned up the kitchen. She mentioned his comment about feeling like an unseen piece of furniture when ignored. Arthur leaned against the counter, admitting with heavy remorse that he too had walked past his son for years without truly seeing him, driven by his own inner guilt. Arthur recounted how, following Ethan's diagnosis, he had thrown himself entirely into work, funding top specialists, therapies, and schools, while mistakenly convincing himself that material provision could substitute for personal connection. He acknowledged that his son had never needed a succession of experts. He simply needed his father sitting on the floor alongside him. He expressed deep gratitude to Dora for showing him where to begin. Dora reflected on her own upbringing, sharing that while her family lacked material wealth, her brother was happy because someone had taken the time to meet him at his level from an early age. She assured Arthur that Ethan now had everything he required to thrive. When Arthur admitted to feeling an ongoing fear of making mistakes in his interaction with Ethan, Dora gently reminded him that a child is not damaged by an imperfect hand sign, but by a parent who chooses distance over the vulnerability of trying. Arthur looked at her thoughtfully in the quiet kitchen, raising his hand to form the sign for the opening flower, her name sign, executed smoothly and without a sound. Dora smiled in response, though she felt a quiet warning in her heart, aware that her growing feelings were becoming complex for someone in her position. The situation became more complicated when Victoria, who had been dating Arthur for 8 months and was frequently featured in social publications as his prospective partner, arrived at the residence unexpectedly on a Wednesday afternoon. She walked into the kitchen to find Arthur, with his sleeves rolled up, sitting on the floor alongside Dora and Ethan, engaged in a quiet, laughter-filled signing session. Victoria paused in the doorway, offering a cool remark about the scene. Arthur stood up immediately to greet her, explaining that Dora was conducting a signing lesson for both him and Ethan. Victoria dismissed the arrangement, arguing that qualified therapists should handle such matters, and questioning why a former hotel employee was present in the home, as if she were family. Arthur defended the decision, noting that hired professionals had failed to engage Ethan for 3 years, whereas Dora had established a connection almost immediately. Victoria stepped closer to Ethan with a rehearsed smile, attempting to usher him away from the area. Ethan, though unable to hear her words, read her facial expressions and posture clearly. Shrinking back toward Dora, he raised his hands and signed a direct question to his father. When Victoria demanded to know what the boy had communicated, Dora hesitated before translating Ethan's remark that Victoria never looked him in the eye. The atmosphere in the room turned sharp. Victoria accused Dora of inserting her own words, but Dora calmly clarified that she was merely providing an accurate translation, suggesting that Victoria could learn the basic manual alphabet herself to communicate directly. Victoria reacted with visible offense at the suggestion of taking advice from household staff. Dora maintained a composure, explaining that deaf children are exceptionally perceptive to facial expressions and genuine attitudes because visual cues are their primary way of understanding people. Victoria turned to Arthur, insisting that he intervene and demand that Dora leave. Arthur addressed Victoria firmly, insisting that she refer to Dora by her proper name. Victoria pressed the issue, demanding an immediate private conversation with Arthur, while instructing Dora to collect her pay and depart. Before stepping aside, Dora spoke quietly with Ethan through signs, reassuring him that he was valued and reminding him not to absorb negative attitudes from others. As Dora gathered her belongings, Arthur followed her to the entryway to apologize for the confrontation. Dora advised him to make his decisions with Ethan's long-term well-being in mind rather than focusing on external appearances. That evening, Arthur and Victoria engaged in a serious discussion in the study. Victoria expressed frustration over social perceptions, insisting that their upcoming formal engagement dinner required a standard presentation, suggesting that Ethan remain upstairs with a nanny during the event to avoid any unconventional displays of sign language at the main table. Arthur responded firmly, stating that his son was not a spectacle to be hidden away. He shared how deeply moved he had been when Ethan signed his affection weeks earlier, asking Victoria when she had last expressed a genuine emotion toward him. Victoria countered that their relationship had been built on mutual social standing and suitability, accusing Arthur of changing his perspective since Dora's arrival. Arthur asked Victoria a single, pointed question. If she could teach Ethan one sign, what would it be? When Victoria admitted she had never considered the thought, Arthur noted that Dora had considered his son's communication needs within 30 seconds of meeting him, whereas Victoria had not given it a thought in 8 months. He realized then that while Dora viewed Ethan's needs as a priority, Victoria viewed them as an inconvenience. The following afternoon, Arthur met Dora in the garden to discuss the situation. He admitted openly that the engagement gathering was scheduled for 2 weeks away, but confessed his growing realization that his home felt alive when Dora was present and empty when she left. He shared that learning to express affection through signs had opened his eyes to what truly mattered. Dora urged him to exercise caution with his words, pointing out the clear contrast between his high social standing and her modest background as a service worker. She emphasized that she had entered his home solely to give Ethan a voice, reassuring Arthur that father and son now possessed the tools to continue communicating effectively regardless of her presence. When Arthur asked what her response would be if he were an ordinary man without social obligations, Dora spoke with complete candor. She admitted that she would say yes without hesitation. As a man willing to sit on the kitchen floor to learn his son's language was precisely the kind of person she respected most. However, she insisted that he had to address his existing obligations directly with Victoria and his family before any personal conversations could take place between them. During the 2 weeks that followed, preparations proceeded for the formal gathering at the estate, featuring 40 prominent guests, elaborate floral arrangements, and media coverage in the courtyard. Upstairs in his room, Ethan sat quietly with an attendant who did not know sign language, feeling isolated from the event taking place below. Dora had not been included on the guest list, but at 9 o'clock that evening, she received a short, awkwardly typed message on her phone, indicating that Ethan wished to see her at the side entrance. She arrived promptly, making her way up the service staircase to Ethan's room. The boy immediately embraced her, signing in a hurry that he had been placed upstairs because others felt his presence would disrupt the event. Dora knelt beside him and asked if he wanted to go downstairs. Ethan admitted he was hesitant, fearing that people would stare without understanding him. Dora reminded him of the night they first met at the gala, promising that if he chose to go down, she would stand beside him and translate every gesture into spoken words, so that no one could ignore his message. They counted to 5 together to settle his nerves, just as they had done during their first encounter. Dora assured him that his father, who had worked diligently to learn his language, would welcome hearing from him. Reassured by her commitment to stand by him, Ethan took her hand, and together they walked down the main staircase. As they entered the formal dining hall, the room fell quiet. Victoria's smile stiffened, while Arthur stood up from his seat at the head of the table, his expression a mix of surprise and anticipation. Victoria attempted to dismiss their presence as an unnecessary distraction, but Arthur intervened firmly, stating that his son had every right to be heard. Ethan stepped into the center of the room, surrounded by 40 tuxedo-clad guests and formal press representatives. Raising his hands, he began to sign with steady, deliberate movements, while Dora provided a clear, audible translation for the entire room to hear. Ethan signed that although he could not hear spoken words, he understood everything occurring around him. He noted that he could easily distinguish between those who looked him in the eye and those who merely focused on appearances. He pointed out that with the exception of 2 people in his life, no one at the table had made an effort to learn his language. Victoria attempted to interrupt, claiming the boy was merely repeating rehearsed actions. But Dora maintained her steady tone, explaining that she had taught him the mechanics of signing, but the thoughts expressed were entirely his own. Ethan continued, signing that he was no longer willing to remain quiet or hide away. Turning directly toward his father, Ethan signed his core message with total clarity. Dora translated his words, her voice steady, despite the emotion of the moment. Ethan was asking not for a flawless household, but for a home where his family communicated with him in his own language. The room remained completely silent. Ethan then executed 2 final gestures, forming the sign for the opening flower, followed by a firm gesture pointing to Dora and then toward the floor. When an attending relative asked for a translation, Arthur stepped forward, having learned the sign himself over the past several weeks. He stated clearly that his son was asking Dora to stay. Arthur turned to Victoria and addressed her directly, observing that despite having months to do so, she had never made an effort to learn a single sign or connect with Ethan at his level. Victoria silently removed her engagement ring, placed it on the table, and departed from the venue. Arthur's mother, an elderly woman who had been watching from the head table, slowly rose from her chair and walked over to Ethan. Kneeling down with some effort, she took the boy's hands in her own and asked Dora to teach her how to apologize to her grandson for taking 7 years to truly see him. Dora demonstrated the gesture of placing a palm over the chest, which the grandmother replicated with tears in her eyes. Ethan smiled warmly and wrapped his arms around her neck. Arthur walked over to Dora amidst the remaining guests. He shared that after weeks of practicing signs with his son, he wished to learn how to ask her never to leave. Dora smiled softly, explaining that no standard sign existed for that exact phrase. Arthur invited her to create one, just as she had created her personal name sign. Dora guided his fingers into position, matching their hands together, just as she had on her first day at the house. 1 month later, the formal gatherings and media attention were entirely in the past. In their place was a warm kitchen, 3 coffee cups on the counter, and 3 people gathered on the floor continuing to learn their shared language word by word. Dora sat cross-legged near the counter, playfully testing Arthur on his progress. Arthur demonstrated the sign for family by intertwining his fingers and moving his hands in a smooth circle, executing the motion correctly on his first attempt. Ethan laughed silently through signs, teasing his father that his execution was surprisingly accurate for once. Dora observed with genuine satisfaction that Arthur could now understand and converse with Ethan independently without requiring her to translate. Arthur looked at her thoughtfully, stating that while Ethan was now fully capable of communicating his needs, Arthur still relied on her presence just as much. He raised his hand to execute the new sign they had developed together, the gesture meaning to remain together permanently, acknowledging that he was committed to learning every aspect of the language alongside her. Ethan watched both of them closely before demonstrating a brand new sign he had created on his own. He pointed first to himself, then to his father, then to Dora, before bringing all 3 fingers together over his heart. When Arthur asked what the new gesture represented, Dora translated with tears of joy in her eyes, explaining that Ethan had just created his own sign for home, defining it as the 3 of them together. The very first sign Arthur had mastered perfectly was the opening flower representing Dora's name. The second was the request to stay, and the third was the symbol his son had created for their family. In that kitchen, the boys' silent laughter filled the home far more completely than any orchestra ever could. When we look closely at this story, it reminds us of a fundamental truth about human connection that becomes increasingly clear as the years go by. True love is never just a feeling we hold inside, or a set of comfortable words we repeat out of habit. Genuine love is, above all else, an active commitment to learning. It is the willingness to step out of our own comfort zones, lower our pride, and meet the people we care about exactly where they are, even when doing so feels unfamiliar. difficult, or entirely outside our usual routines. For 7 long years, Arthur believed he was fulfilling his role as a devoted father by working tirelessly, providing high material comfort, and hiring the most qualified professionals money could buy. Yet, despite his good intentions, a deep chasm remained between him and his son. The breakthrough did not happen through grand gestures, expensive programs, or expert advice. It occurred the very moment he was willing to drop to his knees on the kitchen floor, look his son in the eye, and take on the quiet, humble work of learning a new way to speak. In our own lives, we often expect the people we love to adapt to our rhythm, to understand our perspective, and to speak our language. We get comfortable in our established habits and wonder why distance grows in our relationships. But the quiet wisdom of aging teaches us that the richest, most meaningful bonds are built by those who are willing to do the opposite, those who take the time to observe, to listen with full attention, and to learn the specific emotional language of the people in their care. Whether we express our support through patient listening, small daily acts of service, or simply taking the time to truly see someone who feels invisible to the rest of the world, making the effort to bridge that gap is the most profound gift we can offer. At the end of our journey, the measure of our lives will not be found in the status we achieved or the comforts we accumulated, but in how well we learned to communicate love to those who needed it most.